I don't know.
I would throw it.
To just go there, look around.
That's not really good advice.
This is the first experiment of CEDEC to try to have a panel on issue of public policy. I guess we started with an interesting topic, at least we thought it was, but with bad luck with transportation, flu, and even the rain. But nevertheless, we're happy to have, we lost on the way the other two panelists, the last less than 24 hours. Manuel made it from Mexico, so thanks for coming. And let me give you a few words about Manuel Ramos Francia. We go back a long time. We met first in '93. I think I was visiting ITAM, and you had just, he's a PhD from Yale, right? A student from ITAM, but college, but PhD from Yale. And I think you were starting your academic career there a year or two before. And Manuel has worked there for a while and then continued on in public service, has gone through various levels at the Banco de Mexico, the Central Bank of Mexico, until being a member of the board and subgobernador, which is vice president. There is only one, not many, like in American banks. And since then, after ending that, part of his life is being the director of Semla, which is a research center in Mexico City that kind of supported or is part of a network of all the Latin American central banks. So they work on monetary issues. So we're happy to have Manuel. I'm glad he made it all the way here. Hope you had a good stay so far. The way we'll proceed, the idea was to run a bunch of different topics with Professor Buera moderating and asking the question, provoking the debate. But given that there is Manuel, I guess the way we'll go, Paco had prepared a small presentation, he told me, just in case. Mm-hmm. And Manuel had a bigger one on the back. So this morning we said, okay, let's change strategy. So we'll go with a presentation by Manuel first, and then we'll open the debate. So one thing that we might gain is that there is probably more space, more time for questions from the audience. So we have more a panel atmosphere. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michele. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. So as Michele was saying, I was asked to sort of like not make an organic presentation, but sort of like put 2 or 3 topics on the table. And then Paco Buera would, I guess, start, some kind of debate or discussion among us. So at first, I only brought a couple of slides. Now that I have had different information in the morning, I put a few more slides. And instead of the 3 topics that I was originally going to talk about, I'm only going to talk about 2. I just perhaps mention very briefly the third one, but I'm going to get into a little more detail. And the topics are going to be, the first one, I'm going to talk a little bit about complex financial market dynamics. This is a topic that is has been in the last few years of huge interest. Certainly, there have been episodes that have given rise to very complicated financial market dynamics in EMEs. But this is not limited to EMEs. This pertains to basically certain kind of situations, also in very deep and markets for assets that are core assets like U.S. Treasuries and so on. But that in terms of EMEs, we have faced some of these issues, and it certainly has made, during those episodes, macro management and monetary management very complicated. So I'm going to talk about that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about growth in Mexico. Usually, there's a big question for those of you that have studied growth, especially in Latin America, where it is thought, well, most of these countries, not all, but certainly most, are doing quite well. They have very good central banks. They have a lot of human capital in terms of economists. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but they are very sensible people. They have low, stable inflation. They have even bond markets which go all the way to 5, 20, 30 years. Even Mexico has not too long ago issued a consul. So the question is, what's going on? Why don't they grow? And if you look at the growth performance of countries like Colombia, Peru, Mexico, perhaps Chile is a little bit the exception. But the point is that there just doesn't seem to be enough growth coming out of the economy. And in the case of Mexico, and I'm going to concentrate a little bit in the case of Mexico, because I think that's the case that I know best, although some of these things are going to be applying to most of the countries in the region. The problem is even worse because everybody thinks, well, you've had access to the US market under very good conditions, under preference conditions. given NAFTA. And now they're renegotiating NAFTA, which is the USMC. And the question is, even with that, still, furthermore, if you look at the process of opening up economies, and you have sort of like certain manufacturing cycles, perhaps the first one that is well known to you is Japan. So you weren't even born yet, but I remember when I was a kid, when I was a young age, let's say in the 70s, 80s, people thought, well, don't buy, well, not in the 80s, but certainly the 70s, perhaps early 70s, don't buy a watch or a car from Japan. Very, very bad quality. Well, we know where all this ended. Then came the turn of Korea. And then it has been China. So the common thing is that through different policies, they have clearly started their manufacturing cycles as exporting countries of relatively low skill intensive goods. And then gradually climbing up the value chain, something that did not happen in Mexico. So what's in Mexico that is holding down growth? And I'm going to go a little bit into that. This is something, of course, that while I was at the Minister of Finance and now and then at the Bank of Mexico, we thought about a lot. And I think that there's some very interesting things that can be said. This is not coming directly from my work, but from somebody whom I'm close to, whose name is Santiago Levy. And I'll be talking a little bit about that too. So let me talk about the first topic. So in previous to the global financial crisis, and I don't know how much some of you have read about this, but the episodes of capital flow volatility, and more generally, I would say financial market volatility, I think were clearly of a different nature than the most recent ones. Discussion, if you remember, concentrated in all of these push and pull factors. And the reasons behind this financial market volatility lie in examples like informational cascades, rational bubbles, asymmetric or incomplete information, and so on. But more recently, the emphasis on complex market dynamics has risen from the fact, or the empirical fact, that under certain conditions, there are perverse demand responses to certain shocks. And the point here is that asset sales beget further asset sales. And I'm sure that some of you have read particular episodes of this, but what I mean is that usually if let's say the price of an asset goes down, usually somebody in the market will take the other side and will buy that asset at a more attractive price. But under certain conditions, this doesn't happen. There is not a demand for that asset, but on the contrary, that asset sale, for some reason and under some circumstances, begets further asset sales. So that means that there is a lot of volatility in terms of the price of the asset. And in fact, under certain conditions, as we know from many examples in the last few years, markets can even stop or cease functioning and freeze. Recent examples of this kind of episodes is the basis trade. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the basis trade. Very rapidly, basis trade is you buy, let's say, treasuries in the spot market and you sell them in the futures market. Basically, you benefit from a very small spread, given that the spread is very small, and that is that's clear from a market such as treasuries. You really have to put a lot of volume into the operation for it to be profitable. And the point is that both sides of the trade, the buying and the selling, but let's concentrate on the buying, of course, can be leveraged. So what happened just very recently, last year, and something similar happening in the repo market in 2019, also here in the US. Well, what happened is that, of course, the volume of operation of this trade has been very, very large. And let's say that we had long interest rate jump like we had last year. And Of course, if interest rates go up very quickly, the value of the asset goes down and the trade becomes non-profitable. But for those that funded the trade, that financed the purchasers of the asset, of course they're going to want to have their money back. So the purchasers of the bond in the spot market will have to meet margin calls. And for them to meet those margin calls, they will further sell assets. So instead of selling the asset and finding somebody that buys that finds the price attractive, because of the margin calls, the people that want now to have to sell the asset are going to have to sell further the asset. That's one clear example of this. And what I'm going to talk about now is another example of this. But before I go into another example, let's go into the insurance market, because these complex market dynamics can also you can also find them in very boring cases, like, for example, insurance. Well, some of you may you hear actuarial sciences and may not find that boring. I find it myself a little bit boring. But let's say that you have your assets at 10 years and your liabilities at 30 years. And long-term rates increase dramatically like they did last year here in the US. So, of course, the duration on the liability side is going to come in much faster than on the asset side. And at the end of the day, the insurer may end up with too much duration. He's going to have to sell, again, duration, that is, sell the asset. Again, asset sales beget further asset sales. I can also tell you about cases of this in FX markets, not only in case of EME's markets, but in cases like have happened of the New Zealand dollar or the Norwegian krone. And I'm going to concentrate now in a particular issue that has this very complex market dynamic that has to do with the nature of global asset managers. So after the global financial crisis, there was an increase in capital flow volatility. This you can see in this graph. These are net weekly bond flows for Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru for 10-year bonds. And you'll see all of the bonds, for these countries. And you see two things, or you see many things, but two things stand out. The first one is, after the global financial crisis, very important increase in volatility, but also these kind of events that lead to extreme outflows. You have it in the case of the global financial crisis itself, of the euro crisis, of the taper tantrum, of Brexit, of COVID-19, and so on. These are bond outflows in this case, but generally speaking, asset outflows that are extremely difficult to justify in terms of a problem with fundamentals, a balance of payments crisis, fiscal mismanagement, or whatever, which, by the way, as I was commenting before, gave rise to all of the previous literature. Something else is happening here. Something else, yes?
Is this country together or one by one?
No, these are all together.
Together, okay.
All
So
together.
I only see one line.
Yeah.
One.
No, these are all together for Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. And the point here is that something else is going on. So this is not something that you say, well, of course it's clear. This is speculative attack. This is something that you are doing wrong, and people are just going to reduce their exposure to your assets.
Who is the counterparty of this trade? Is it a domestic financial institution, or is
No, these are global asset managers and the issuers, sovereign issuers.
Yeah, but that's kind of so the counterparty is the government issuing.
Yeah, the counterparty. These are government
I
bonds.
mean, in this flow out when these are.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah.
That's where who catches them. Yeah.
It's actually somebody's selling. They sell. There's a foreign. They're selling these
Yeah.
positions.
This is exactly where I'm going in a minute. Who catches these? If everybody wants to go out, the door is quite close. Who's going to be catching these bonds? Well, the point is that you have the buyers of these bonds, or the ones that are usually domestic banks. But let me tell you under which conditions. So the point is they're in very important outflows. And as you can see in the lower part of the graph, the volatility and the magnitude of extreme negative events have been increasing in time, and the emerging markets are vulnerable, and this is the beginning of the answer, to non-resident bondholders and to global financial events. Now let me go back for a minute here. As I was saying, something else is happening than mismanagement, and I'll go to all of the finance side in a minute. And the point is, there are two things that stand out. One is there was a very important shift from banks to global asset managers as key players. As you all know, just take into account the Volcker rule that prohibits to banks proprietary trading. And you'll see that the natural function for market making that banks had previous to that is certainly much diminished. Certainly banks don't have the heft that they did before the global financial crisis, and that is directly by regulation. Somebody had to take their place. Who was taking their place, of course, has been global asset managers. As you know, those are unfunded, they are not leveraged, and they are not subject to the kind of regulation like the Volcker rule and so on. And these are the ones that have come into emerging markets, and I'll go into that in a moment. And there is also the nature of how they invest, the rise of passive investing and automated trading, including algorithmic and high-frequency trading. Okay, so let me just show you this very quickly. On the left side is the total volume of assets under management. And on the right side is the share of EME's bondholders by type. And as you can see, the dark blue part of the figure, which has foreign non-banks, has increased dramatically, all the way up to 45%. So what have we observed? We observed that ETFs have presented an eightfold increase since 2010, and that foreign non-bank financial institutions went from representing about 10% of EME debt holders as of 2005 to more than 45% in 2020. Now, let me go into this. What's going on? And I think that in order to better understand this, I have to go into this with a little more detail. So think about this in terms, I'm not going to go very deep into some of these things. I'm sure that even some of you are familiar with this, but think about everything is circumscribed within a global monetary game. And you have mainly on one side two agents. You have households, which have money they want to invest in, and asset managers. And the point is that the households are risk averse and the asset managers are risk neutral. And of course, given that, you have a principal agent problem. You have a principal agent problem in the sense that the asset managers are too far removed from the partners or the capitalists or the households that have their money in the funds. And the asset managers have a choice. They either can invest one unit of the resources into a money market fund or a money market account, or they can go into a risky bond like an EM bond. Now, the way to reduce or to mitigate the principal agent problem, of course, is through monitoring. And the monitoring instrument that you use is ranking the yields that they obtain. Why do they rank the yields of the obtain? This is public information, of course. And with that, you can certainly see whether the fund manager that is managing your funds, that is managing your resources, is a good one or he's not that good. And those that are not that good, as we know from the asset managing industry, can be fired very quickly, and the fund itself confront or face very important redemptions. That is, if you're ranking last, it's going to be very easy or relatively easy to identify you, and it's going to be relatively easy to get your money out of the fund which that not very good asset manager is managing. So there is going to be an aversion to ranking last. And this aversion to ranking last is going to be leading to a herd-like type behavior. And this is something that when, for example, I was still at the bank and talking with all of these investors, everybody is very much conscious about this. When I asked them, you have a government in some Latin American economies. They're certainly choosing policy mixes that are not that great. In fact, I'm being very low key here. Perhaps policies, economic policies that are certainly different than what they've looked in the last few years of macro stability and so on. Why are you still, sending the resources to Mexico, apart from the fact that US rates, of course, were very, very low? It's as if they always met with central bank officials or Ministry of Finance officials, not asking them, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? But please tell me and justify why, because I need this justification to stay here. I don't want to be the first one to leave, to have made a mistake, and then to be fired because those other ones took the chance for whatever reason, stayed, nothing happened, and of course they got quite a good yield. So nobody wants to be last. Nobody wants to have a bad rank. And that certainly, plus some of the things that I'm going to say, leads to herd-like type behavior. What happens if one of these investors sells the asset? And usually this industry, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it, what you will see is that it's bigger, the big ones like the BlackRocks and the PIMCOs and so on, the ones that have a lot of the assets, and a lot of smaller ones that are sort of like followers. And the big ones usually have a lot of advantage knowing the officials in the country, risk analysis that they do, information that they can glean much more efficiently than the others and so on. And what you have is what happens if one of these does sell the asset. What you will see is the smaller ones are certainly going to follow, because if that one is certainly going to go out, I'm not going to look at the price of the asset, which is going to decrease as more attractive. I'm going to do exactly the same that he does, and I'm also going to sell my assets. And again, you have this very perverse demand response. Asset sales beget further asset sales. And then you have an extreme outflow. What compounds the problem? What compounds the problem is that usually the instruments that are used by these type of investors are ETFs or more wide indexes like the WIGBY. Since everybody has pretty much the same exposure, the big ones having, let's say, given a signal to the smaller ones, but everybody concentrated very much on certain exposure. And given the nature of passive investment, what does that lead to? Certainly does lead as a first step to crowded trades. And crowded trades mean, of course, that everybody is, as Paco was asking a little ago, who is there to catch onto these bonds? And either in the case of some programs that have happened during these episodes, for example, in Mexico, it's either the government puts in place, they buy directly, they repurchase those bonds, or they put in place a program like, for example, a interest rate swap. And they certainly reduce the duration for those bonds, and they keep the duration. And that's the way they give the exit to all of those that want to sell the long-term asset. And the point here is that these crowded trades, again, is very problematic, because you don't have anybody, that everybody wants at some point in time to sell the asset, and there are no catchers. There's nobody to get to buy them. And furthermore, this algorithmic trading, what we have found, and this is something that we went, of course, talking when I was at the central bank with our counterparts, the investors and so on. These are passive, mostly instruments, ETFs and so on, and they're done through automated anonymous electronic platforms. And in the algorithm, usually what you have is these famous kill switches. And the kill switch is, if the change in the price of the assets is of such magnitude, you stop all trade. That means that what during normal times seems to be an asset which is trading in high volume, which is really doing quite well, under conditions of stress, as most of you already know, algorithmic provided liquidity dries up very quickly. So what would, at a first glance, look at, well, this algorithm, whatever, I want to put this type of exchange, this type of platform, we think that there's going to be a lot of activity. Yes, under normal times, it seems like everything's great, and it seems like the volume certainly can increase, and that's what everybody wants. But the problem is that under stress conditions, let's say something happens, like the euro crisis or Brexit, whatever, under those conditions, algorithmic provided liquidity dries up very, very quickly. So again, we have a situation where the nature of the players, where the technology and the type of instruments that they use means that there is the probability of important capital outflows increases dramatically, and thus the probability or the liquidity risk under stress conditions increases dramatically. Now, there is a counterpart to this story. The first one is, of course, as a central bank or as a minister of finance or as a financial authority, you want to insure against these episodes. And what you do is you self-insure either through reserves, but when the possibility, which by the way, as you know, is very costly, just look at the central bank T account, and you'll see that funding a very large international FX position is very, very costly for the country. But when the possibility of the extreme outflow is so big that perhaps even your reserves are not enough, you have to go into a liquidity provision by a core central bank. In the case of Latin America, it's been mainly for Brazil, and Mexico has been bilateral swap lines with the Fed, or this repo line, the FEMA, that the Fed put in place for, in the case of Latin America, Chile, Peru, and Colombia. And in both cases, and this is what I'm leading to, the point is that this is one of the reasons that we've seen that even with the change of signals in terms of policy that some governments have done in the area, and I'm talking about macro policy, and also about, not only about macro policy, but also about the kind of signals that they're giving in terms of structural policies in the economies, where, of course, ex ante, you would think, but this is exactly going against what you should be doing. And the persistence of this, they don't take their money out as of late. They did before, but now something seems to be going on, in the sense that no matter what these people do, some of these governments, there will be a persistent in terms of it's going to be very difficult for them to exit. Why? Because they know that if it comes to the point where they have to exit, there will be liquidity provision, and the exit will not be costly. So I think that there is, even as you can see what's happening in some of these Latin American countries, especially with the exchange rate, and with some of these governments that are certainly taking economic policy decisions which do not seem to be very, very wise, and there's still money and resources come in and flow in, and nobody wants to go. They're terrified of ranking last, as I was commenting, and they know that any exit now will be accommodated. How can you accommodate these exits? As I was saying, well, you accommodate through, and the FX market is very much linked to the bond market, as you know. Some investors go into Latin America with covered positions, but some go naked. And as you know, that basically the intervention can be directly in the bond market or in the FX market. And that's how you make the possible exit even cost-free. And now they feel that they don't have to exit. Basically, there is a perception in some places in Latin America that there is an enormous mispricing of risk now. And that basically the moral hazard that is the other face of the coin of these very timely and opportune episodes of liquidity provisions, where the countries have faced the possibility of extreme capital outflows, has been very effective in stopping and stabilizing financial markets, has a very unpleasant face on the other side, which is a very important moral hazard. So that's let me finish with this topic. So since the global financial crisis, complex market dynamics sometimes arise from perverse demand responses. And the negative externalities of GAMs arise from mainly four things. One is their nature, because of they are averse to ranking last, the use of passive investment vehicles like ETFs, automated trading, and of course the availability of almost immediate redemptions. As you know, these funds, they offer a lot more liquidity than they have. They are invested, let's say, in 10-year bonds in Mexico, in Chile, in Peru, and yet they offer, if you're not satisfied with the asset manager, you want to take your money to another fund manager, they offer liquidity basically almost immediately. And that is a tremendous externality for the issuer of the bond. But I'm not going to talk about that. And of course, the timely provision of liquidity, as I was commenting, in FX and sometimes in bond markets under conditions of market stress are crucial to ensure the proper functioning. But this has a very adverse phase, seems to be, which is increasing moral hazard. As I was mentioning at the beginning, some people are even thinking, well, where are the bond vigilantes that we used to hate that much in the 80s, 90s? Seems like there is no disciplining mechanism coming from bond investors and so on in some of these countries. Now, let me go to the second topic, which I think tries to go to the heart of this big question that policymakers and that societies in some Latin American countries frequently ask themselves, rather naively, I think, and in some way trying not to listen to the possible reasonable answers, which is, why don't we grow? And let me go very quickly in 3 steps here. The first one is, since about 1990, the policies that have been put in place in these countries, and some of you that have studied these countries will find very familiar, have two, let's say, axes. They have 2-pronged strategies. The first one is a growth component, which basically was to clean house in terms of macroeconomic policy. You have central bank autonomy in the early 90s for most of these countries. You have the adoption of flexible exchange rates, very much necessary after the experience of some of these countries have had with rigid exchange rates, fiscal discipline, and what happened after crises like the tequila crisis, which is prudent financial regulation. And GDP growth would be the result of more productivity because of this, let's say, cleaning up of macro problems and the growth of capital and labor. And the policies for productivity growth were trade liberalization, of course, for example, in the case of Mexico, NAFTA, and many other free trade agreements that Mexico has. The setting up institutions like the Competition Commission and others, and the privatization of state-owned enterprises. And the idea of the rationale was to open up and create sort of like an environment of competition that would give the right incentives for firms to be more productive. In the part of the growth of capital and labor, there would be more domestic investment, resulting, of course, from macro stability, more foreign investment, more FDI from the FTAs, and a more effective labor force. But it had another component, which is the social inclusion component. And the social inclusion would be, there is a very large part of the economy which is informal, which is illegal, which really is not very productive. And part of the reason why this has happened is because they have not had access to social security, to healthcare, to, at the time, pensions, to education, and so on. And the main, let's say, the sort of like the strategies were, there was social insurance for formal workers. That is the Mexican Social Security Institute, which has to do with pensions, with healthcare, with insurance for accidents in the workplace, with daycare, and so on. Infonavit, which is a fund for social interest housing, minimum wages, and dismissal regulations. But, and here starts the problem, the social insurance for informal workers, where you had not contributory pensions, you had the famous Seguro Popular, and other health programs, plus daycare programs, plus household housing subsidies, plus other benefits like microcredits and so on. So you start seeing here the problem, which is bifurcating the social security and treating very differently salaried workers than non-salaried workers and firms that operate in a formal, let's say in the formal sector, and firms that operate informally. And as a third, the direct poverty alleviation programs, like programs, targeted transfers, the most important ones was Progresa, Oportunidades, and Prospera. You probably heard about some of these transfers. They originated in Mexico, precisely with Santiago Levy. And these are transfers that are conditional on the family or the household, the poor household, or the household that qualifies to be under the poverty line, has to do certain actions to receive the transfers. The first thing that was done was that the man, let's say the boss of the household, who used to be the man, did not receive these transfers. Because as you know very well, he used to go on a Friday out, drink them, and do other things with those resources. So now the woman, the mother, is the one that receives those transfers. Second is the mother had to show that the kid was going to the doctor, that he was going to school, that he was eating at school, that he was taking the medicine that the doctor prescribed, and so on. Now, these type of poverty alleviation, which are targeted transfers, plus other transfers. Now, the problem here has been, this sounds very, very good, right? This sounds reasonable. That is, make a formal sector more productive through competition and through this type of thing, liberalizing, opening up the economy, so they either compete or they die. And to all of those that are not really protected, they don't have access to social security in the formal sector to cover them, to protect them in some way. But now you're giving rise to a bifurcated social security system, one in the formal sector and one for the informal sector. And let me put very briefly how this is the next to last slide. And this is directly from Santiago, and I think at the end of, I'm going to try to explain a little bit this, but let me just go through the steps. Why there is, given the interaction of all of these policies, especially in the labor market, why it yields the kind of very low TFP growth that we've seen, which is of course the main issue why growth seems to be really hindered and contained down in this type of country. So the legal framework, as I was commenting, excludes not salaried workers from Social Security. Only if you're in the formal sector, that is usually very big firms that are efficient and they are in the tradable goods sector. The value of benefits provided by IMSS, nevertheless, Infonavit and Afores, which are the pension funds, and labor regulation is lower than their cost. Everybody has heard stories, well, if you know these countries, that certainly the value of Social Security, for example, of health, the health services they provide, certainly less than what you pay for them. There are these stories that you get to the IMSS hospital, and if you're literally having a heart attack and you're dying in front of them, they tell you to come back in a couple of weeks. So this is something that you may think is kind of a joke. It is not. And this is something that happens not seldom, but on a lot of occasions. I know when I hear the British people complaining about the National Health Services, you should, go to IMSS and see really what happens when things go south, And the point is that overall, in the formal sector, and this is a perception that is certainly generalized, the cost of these services, that is the contribution that you make to get these services, is certainly a lot higher, or the perception is, and I think not only the perception, but it is a lot higher than the benefits that you receive from them. That's a tax, very important tax. And formal economic activities thus is also taxed, as you know, through income taxes and so on. So the second step is there are special tax regimes, microcredits and other programs that subsidize informal firms. In fact, for you to qualify, for some firms to qualify for these programs, you have to be informal. On many occasions, you can be informal and not illegal, depending on the type of activity that you do. And for you to get these microcredits or other type of benefits, for example, special tax regimes and so on that are basically have very low or zero tax burden, you even have to be informal. It's very ironic. And they attract capital and labor and capture part of the markets of goods and services. So large formal firms grow and become more productive. Small and medium-sized firms do not grow. And now we can see this in the Mexican economic census. There are economic census from the 88, I think was the first one, then you can look at the 94, all the way up to 98 and to 2018, 2022. And I'm talking about mainly, basically comparing, you can follow each firm through time. And we have sort of like three kind of combinations. You have firms that have begun being formal, and they, at the end of the day, they either disappear or they become informal. Firms that are informal, that at the end of the day become formal, very few ones, almost non-existent. That they stay informal or that they disappear. You do have, when I'm talking about the economic census, you have in the last one, well, not the last one, the next to last, in 2018, you have 6,300,000 firms. And the ones in 1994, 1990, I don't remember very well, but it was about close to 4 million firms. And there is a huge amount of churn. Entering and exiting. The problem is the nature of that churn, given what happens in Social Security and what happens in the labor market, which I will go to in a moment. As a result of this, aggregate productivity stagnates. Per capita GDP grows only from the accumulation of capital and labor. Average labor earnings do not grow. Workers transitions between formality and informality all the time. It's very difficult because you can follow in some census also the status of the worker, of the same worker for a long time. And you'll see that you have a lot of workers that rotate between being formal and then informal and then formal again and informal. And at the end of the day, when they retire, if they don't have enough weeks of contributing, they will not even be able to enjoy the benefits when they retire. So this is the design of this is really complicated, and certainly, given some of these things that I've been saying, they certainly tax being in the formal sector and they subsidize being in informality. So if we go on to the next step, we see that informal social insurance institutions subsidize informal economic activity. Poor workers fall to obtain higher productivity jobs. Targeted poverty programs for the poor expand, as well as other social programs for low-income households and some conditioned on informal status. And let me finish with this, trying to go through the general equilibrium of all of this. So first, we need to take into account the interaction of both policy components in the labor market. One was supposed to be make this market grow, open up, liberalize, compete, and make this sector grow and grow and grow, where workers have access to formal social security. Of course, firms are going to be taxed and so on. Everything works like it should be working. And for all of those that are left behind, which is a very large part of the population, you put all of these social inclusion policies. Try to build up their human capital so as to be able to enter at some point the formal sector. And of course, reduce the informality. Now, as I was commenting, there is a very high degree of firm churning, but very inefficient. And this is something that we found in the census that I was talking about. Firms maintain small size either to stay under the radar because they're informal, and most of the informal the firms that operate informality are illegal, or to be able to be beneficiaries of some policies. So look at those two incentives. One is, I'm going to have a relatively small operation because if I, of course, grow, that's going to go against me because I'm going to be certainly have a higher probability of being under the fiscal authorities' eye. And thus, there is an incentive for these firms to have a small operation. They certainly will not be able to get to the optimal size plant. They will not be able to get advantage of economies of scale or economies of scope. And certainly the type of investment that they're going to do is not going to be cutting-edge technology or cutting-edge, let's say, fiscal capital. And on the other hand, if they stay informal, they will be able not only to operate with workers where they don't have to contribute to the social security system, but where they will be able to be beneficiaries of other type of programs, only if they are informal, like small tax credits and, special tax regimes and some other subsidies. Terrible signal. Absolutely terrible signal. You are taxed in many ways if you go to formal sector, both as a firm and as a worker, and you are subsidized if you go into informality, if you are a firm or if you are as a worker. So we have here that in terms of the firm productivity, we have a lot of, not that much of a survival rate. There's a lot of rotation. But the big point here is that given these incentives, and we can follow each firm, and at each point in time, well, these are the different sessions, economic census every 4 years, we can plot and we can obtain the distribution of the firms in terms of productivity. And you'll see here, as this work shows, that we get two things in terms of the distribution of the productivity of these firms. Both tails get fatter. Of course, much fatter the left one, low productivity or negative even productivity, than the right one. And again, you have precisely the contrary that you would expect from the reasonable firm dynamics that you would expect, or not reasonable, the efficient firm dynamics that you would expect, let's say, from Schumpeterian dynamics. That is, you don't have creative destruction. You have a lot of debts, and the firms that are incorporating themselves and being caught by the census, you'll see that a lot of them are ending up in the left side of the productivity distribution. So we don't have, as Santiago Levy has said, we don't have a creative destruction, we have destructive creation because of the price signals that we have, the relative prices between formality and informality. So even with more schooling now, and this is something that is also a very important finding, because many people say, well, look at the schooling results. And you'll see that even although a lot of said in terms of schooling, for example, in Mexico is not that great, the university should be better on average, and so on. But if you look at the PISA scores and other measures in terms of universities, because PISA scores are not for university students, you see that education seems to be increasing, at least during some years in Mexico. But if you try to do any study in terms of whether these higher schooling levels are being rewarded, you find that they are not. And why are they not rewarded? Why, if you get more schooling, at the end of the day, you're not being rewarded? It's very easy, because it is costly to operate in the formal sector of the economy. You are taxed heavily. You have to pay for accountants, lawyers. You get protected in terms of how you compete through FTAs, but you don't get too much domestic protection. Competition really doesn't take place domestically. These are overrepresented in terms of the political decisions that take place, these interests that take place in Congress. We have a competition commission that has basically no teeth, not even the human capital necessary to do these things seriously. So it is going to be very difficult, because even although some of these firms that are big exporters in Mexico, and as you know, Mexico exports a lot, some of these firms are very efficient, but they do not get a sufficient part of GDP They do not produce it in terms of generating continuously good job opportunities for those in the informal sector, even if they are more schooled. So these problems in terms of not only taxing formal activity, but subsidizing informal activity, plus no competition, no really rule of law, a lot of corruption and so on, are yielding this extra effort that has been done in investing in human capital, no yield to that. Because people find themselves with more education, but they still have no access to good job offers. So the point is that, again, we are getting these very, very perverse dynamics. And basically the main price signal that we are getting from that is you're making it very difficult and very expensive to get into the formal sector, which only big oligopolies and big firms can pay. They can hire accountants, they can hire lawyers, they can do whatever they want, they can influence congressmen and so on. And you're making also very cheap to go into the informal sector. And if you're into the informal sector, not only are you being subsidized, which means that the incentive per se is not to get as much schooling because I'm not going to need it. But even to those that say, doesn't matter, I still want to go into the formal sector, you get more schooled, no generation of good jobs for there to be an important absorption of this type of workers that have been in informality or that really haven't had access to better to policies of human capital. The relative price signals are all wrong. And we've like thought, and with this I finish, we sort of like try to think about, all of these things, and some of the answers are a little bit naive. They say, well, there's no competition, there is no level playing field, no rule of law, really no incentives in the economy to be entrepreneurial and so on. But I think that there's something deeper that gives rise to this type of situation. And something deeper, and I don't know whether you're familiar, and it has a very nice explanation to this, something that I think should be read by every policymaker in emerging markets, which is there is a persistent competitive rent preservation. And if you see here, and you can basically tell these stories in the following terms. This is a very nice paper by Rajan, where you see that in an unequally endowed society, and think about, for example, three groups. You have the capitalists, the firm owners, you have the professionals, and you have the workers. And basically, the oligopolists, of course, have rents, as do the professionals, as do the workers. And you will see that even although collectively, let's say a comprehensive reform program would collectively benefit everybody, certainly parts of that comprehensive reform program, which is directed in some sense to reduce rents for all those that are getting it, are going to affect your own rents. And there you're out. And you will always find somebody whose rents is going to be affected, so that you will always be able to block in Congress a comprehensive reform package. There is no equilibrium in this game. And I think it's very nicely described by Rajan. And I think that this is, at the end of the day, a little bit the common denominator of what's going on. I'm not going to go now deeper into that. Although this is economics, but it has a lot more of political economy flavor to it. But you can explain what I just tried to describe through a game where everybody wants to preserve competitively the rents. And this clearly can be, in the case of Mexico, with four groups. One are the firm owners, which is let's say the high income deciles. Second is the middle class, which has some access and some benefits to the formal social security institutions. There is the workers, which are the ones subsidized here. And also they have a lot of rents in the sense of some of these programs. And you don't have to go as far as some of these governments now in Latin America, the type of programs they're putting in place. And certainly you have also the government. And the governments at different levels. The levels of the national government, the federal government, that is, the states and municipalities. And when you have everybody, and the description is almost one-to-one, and it can be made very transparently and clearly. When you have everybody acting as this description suggests, you'll see that we end up in equilibrium, which is very bad for growth, low productivity growth. You will have the equilibrium, which is incredibly stable and incredibly perverse. So to all of those that ask, well, why these countries that are so much human capital, and the macroeconomists in Latin America, and some very good ones, very known ones, and what's going on? Why don't these countries grow? Well, the answer certainly lies much further away than good macroeconomic policies. And some of these elements that I've described are present in many countries that I was talking about. I don't want to go into many other countries because the one, again, that I know the best is Mexico. But I think that many elements are present there. And certainly what is present in most emerging markets is what it says at the end, a very important process of competitive rent preservation. So with that, I'm not going to go into the third topic. I think I already spoke too much. So with that, those are the two things that I want to put on the table.
Okay. So we open the floor to questions?
Yeah.
So I have a question about my understanding of informality is in developing countries, it's often not so black and white, it's gray. So like you have a formal firm and you have maybe 2 formal workers, but then I pay 5 workers cash in hand. Do you have a sense of in Mexico how black and white it is versus how much is on this like intensive margin of informality? And do you think it matters?
In terms of activity,
Yes.
the measure is informality is between 25 and 30%. In terms of employment, it's close to 60%. So there are a lot of firms, as you said, that are working supposedly in the formal sector, where part of their workforce is informal. So those are the numbers. Employment, about 60% of workers are informal, about 58%. And in terms of the GDP that they produce, it's estimated between 25, about a little less than a third.
Like if the way I interpret that comment is, I cannot take the taxes to be very high and the subsidies very, very high. They seem to be more continuous. So some firms are having some formal workers, some informal. That suggests that it's not.
No, because again, part of this also has to do with, for example, there's a big shock in the economy. And I'm not going to shed labor force. This is a little bit story also you see in advanced economies, in Mexico even more so, because the dismissal regulation is extraordinarily expensive. So I will maintain you in some way, but more like informal. Even though you are formal and now you're going to be informal, but it's going to be, I'm going to find the way to still act legally, but maintain you informally. So you're going to lose Social Security and so on, but I'll still be able to hire you under some form, which at some point in time, the job experience that you have and so on, which are good, firm specific and so on, which are beneficial for my firm, I will be able to get very quickly. So in that sense, yes, but in the sense that it's still, the distortion is present at high or lower degree. But if you act formally, you will be taxed. You can avoid part of the tax, but at the end of the day, you are taxed. You can find ways to elude, and you can always find in countries like Mexico, not to evade, I'm saying to elude. But at the end of the day, it's going to be certainly more expensive for you to try to access or to try to operate in the formal sector than in the informal one, where you're going to be subsidized. I don't know whether that answers what you.
Get it?
Yeah. Then we go to the financial, because I'm very curious of the reading you give of those big outflows.
Yeah.
And we'll do that. I understand the description, it seems to fit with what I know not only of Mexico, many Latin America, and in fact, many Mediterranean economies, both north and south of the water. What I don't follow much is the explanation. For two reasons. One thing I've observed, true, I don't know the Mexican data very well, but I think I know some of the Argentinian data decently and most of the Mediterranean data. They show that there are no rents for the productive workers of what you call the formal sector. In fact, the high productivity workers or potential productive workers of those companies keep flowing out. At least that's the European and North African experience. The other is that you seem to attribute all of the mispricing. So those people don't really have rents. Also because it would be difficult to create a general agreement model in which everybody has rents.
Yes, of course.
Somebody has to pay for the rents.
Of course.
That is an adding up constraint here that has to come from somewhere. The other is that everything in the explanation seems to come from certain labor policies.
Mhm.
Are you really sure this like that? Is that there is essentially a supply of qualified labor that would be able to have higher productivity but doesn't pick that road because the social policy, let's call it that way, various form of subsidies, welfare advantages, make it eventually a negative enterprise, increases the opportunity cost so much that it's not worth it. Well, I have doubt about that because when I think about the numbers I know, they have a hard time to add up. I mean, there are such policies, but I think most of it is really in the huge, at least for the 3-4 countries I know better, these are all European, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece. The huge incentive is actually in the tax evasion. So yes, the government policies are creating incentive, but not because they're spreading around subsidies, family things, stuff like that. No. It's because they're taxing enormously as soon as you put your head in the formal sector. And the cost of that is so large. Countries like Italy and Spain, it's literally close to 2/3 value added for the gross value added gets taxed away in social security, medical aid, medical contribution. So it's mostly the burden in those countries of what people call the welfare state, and that in fact is not really much the welfare state, but it's the state in other aspects. I don't know the Latin American numbers well, so the question is, the Latin American numbers are not about taxes, they're mostly about subsidies. Justify this, explain this historical incentive. Finally, let me say the third question. Are you sure that those educational systems are getting better, I doubt about it. Because it seems to me that what PISA is now measuring is a degree of survival literacy and arithmetic understanding, which has become fairly distant, if not remote, from what you need to know to become a productive worker in the formal sector. Even more productive.
Let me go to, I think that all of your questions go in the same direction. Let's go to the first one. Oh, well, to the second one. To the 4 questions that you posed, let me go to the second, third, and fourth. The second one, is it also these subsidies, or is just trying to evade taxes? That it's so expensive that I will certainly reduce my supply of labor and that I'm going to try to evade this by not working or doing whatever. Gives me the same kind of problem.
Yeah.
But the irony in Latin America is that and this is, I don't think, present in Europe, even the Mediterranean countries that you mentioned and so on, is that the two-pronged policy approach, the second one is specifically targeting through subsidies these more unprotected people. Not that they are educated, that they have human capital and so on, but they don't agree to paying as much money, so they don't work, and they, what we call in Spain, los mileureros, that they give them 1,000 euros, and no, it's injury on top, insult on top of injury, in the sense that independently of whether it's high or low the taxation, I'm going to subsidize you through these programs so that you are going to be able to incorporate yourself in here. So not only am I not going to be I'm not going to be going into the question of whether I tax too much and whether I am disincentivating work and whatever. I'm not going to take that into account. What I'm going to take into account, because that is not something that perhaps you can say of Mexico, it's very costly to operate in the formal sector, not directly only because of taxes, but because of taxes, corruption, red tape, and so on. So, but what I'm going to try to do is try to give you social security coverage, better access to healthcare, better access to pension, and so on, so that you will have more effective human capital, and you'll be able to incorporate all of these growth in jobs that are going to be generated because I'm opening the economy and going to be exporting and so on. The irony is that by bifurcating the social security policies, one is, as you know, funded by contributions and so on, and it's still taxation because the cost of giving those services is higher than the benefits that they provide. And I'm going to fund you with nothing, just free, through the public finances. I'm going to subsidize it. So the relative price is even more, the direction of the relative price is even more pointed than the ones you're saying for the European countries. Not only I'm going to make it very expensive because of taxation plus other things to operate in the formal sector, I'm going to make it very cheap in the other one to try to give you enough human capital to be absorbed into the one. And that policy is intentional. But that policy is distorting all the price signal in terms of whether I am standing now here and I have a decision to make. Do I school myself and do this and do that through all of these subsidies and go into the formal sector, or I just get the subsidies? And look at the programs now, for example, of this very famous program now in Mexico, which is, sometimes when you give the example that's an economics thing and that economics thing is a bad policy, it's very shameful. But these programs that give what we call ninis, ni trabaja ni estudia. And they're getting subsidies. And that's the worst incentives that you can tell these people to get more education, get more human capital to try to incorporate yourself into the formal sector. So I think that the subsidies are crucial, and this is all of the politics. The politics is, I'm not going to go, for example, look at the party in the politics in Mexico and Colombia and so on. I'm not going to make you work better, more productive, feed you and so on. Forget about all of that. Let me get this thing and give you, under no conditions, so much money. And the people that are the beneficiaries of this will tell you, I'm still voting for this guy because I don't care about public security. I don't care whether the school is good or bad. I don't care whether I have money in my pocket. That's the only thing that interests me. So yes, I think that these policies that have been very profitable politically, of subsidizing these type of programs and so on, are helping or reinforcing the very bad, not the very bad, already the complicated signal that taxing or the making it very expensive to operate in the formal sector. They reinforce that. But if you only have the part where you have a very costly operation because of taxation in the formal sector, it will lead to the same kind of things. People saying it's too much, I don't care if I don't work and whatever, the productivity of that will be close to zero, right? So it's the same. But I think the irony here is that I'm doing a policy to try to avoid that, and I'm doing it. I'm generating it. So that's a little bit concerning the education. This is an empirical thing. Also, the first, let's say, the first instinct, for example, when looking at the data in Mexico is, at first, I don't know whether the schooling is getting better or not. And the same kind of very doubtful position. So you go into the numbers. And you go into the numbers, not in terms of PISA exams or whatever, but in terms of schooling, which is the best time that we have, independently whether it's good or bad. It's just, let's say, maintain the level of schooling, whether it's good or bad, constant. And just say that through time, there is more schooling, independently of the level. And that's what we see. And we do see that with more schooling, in any kind of reasonable country, you will see, beginning with the US, that the more schooling is rewarded. You will see any kind of human capital study, schooling study, you'll see all of these regressions. More schooling are rewarded through better earnings. In Mexico, it's not. You don't see that. You see that even if you get more schooling, the earnings are not growing certainly by as much as the schooling or the increase in schooling. And again, the reason is an even further problem, which is not only will the subsidy disincentivize me to get more schooling. Let's say that I think differently, that I don't look at this, it's more a personal thing, it's a non-pecuniary thing for me, and I want to get more schooling and I want to get a shot at the formal sector. Independently of whether if I didn't do this, I would get a subsidy, forget about it. I'm going to do the contrary for my dignity or whatever. Well, even if you do it, and you end up with more schooling and so on, you're not generating enough jobs to absorb that significantly, because the large part, the part of the economy which is formal, which is mainly exporting firms and travel and so on, also are oligopolists. They don't have, they are not very, let's say, very dynamic. They have barriers to entry. They certainly don't go to the production operation which would reflect a competitive equilibrium. They even have pricing power in pesos, let's say in Mexico. Everybody would think, well, yes, but if you're in tradable goods, it doesn't really matter, because through trade, you'll get prices more or less equally. No, you'll see if you go to into pricing of this type of firms in countries, they even have pricing power in their domestic currency. And the bottom line is that not too many can go. First, the firms there, it's very costly to be operating there. And second, everything, the firms that you find yourselves operating in the formal sector are very powerful, very big. They are efficient to compete internationally, but certainly they are not going to be generating, because as part of total GDP, they are only producing about a fifth of GDP and so on. They cannot produce as much as to, in any significant way, absorb anybody that is coming from the informal sector. You see that during the cycle, during the business cycle, they absorb part of the workers, and then in the bad part of the cycle, they again shed them. Then again, they absorb them, they shed them. It's not something that you can do in any significant way, in a sustainable way. So the incentive is there. Well, not only do I have a subsidy, so it's better for me not to do anything, but even if I go through the effort, don't receive the subsidy, but get better schooled and so on, I will not be able to maintain for any amount of decent time a good job with access to better social security in the formal sector. because those kind of jobs are not being generated at a significant quantity. So I don't know whether that more or less answers what you were.
I have a question. I guess two questions. One is a comment. If I were to be discussing your very nice presentation, I would have go back to a nice paper by Garicano, Large, and Barinen.
Mhm.
What they do is they look at the French data.
Yeah.
In France, it's a country where they have a lot of social policies and labor taxes that only bite after 50 employees. And that paper does two things. One thing is to say, well, let's look at whether there's bunching in the data. The theory, a simple look at model will tell you that it's a put taxes on after a size class. I just see a lot of firms bunching on the left of that size class, and then it will be a hole in the distribution right after. And then firms that are like way to the right will not be impacted. You don't see the hole, but in the data you see the jump down and so on and so forth. And the second thing that they do is, so let's use this data and estimate a model and try to get a sense of what are the aggregate macroeconomic costs of that friction. That's very specific side-dependent policies. And the answer is you have an impact, but the impact is not the order of 3% of GDP. And it's sort of intuitive because you're not the very large productive firms. You're not distorting you're distorting. You have a kind of you're not distorting their marginal incentive. I mean, you have it's a tax, but it's not a differential tax between being 1,000 employees or 1,050.
Yeah.
But you have a large distortion in that margin. So then the question is why the results on France are small and Santiago's intuition works. So it has to be that either these subsidies and taxes are very large, or there is something about the simple Lucas model is not capturing. I guess Gaspar, as in your paper, was a little bit exploring that. But what's your take? It is that these subsidies and taxes are very large, so I don't know what is the tax.
My
labor
intuition-
taxes in France will be like, I don't know,
My intuition would be-
40%. Well,
yeah.
these are 40 plus subsidy of 40, and this is very large. There is a mechanism that is more complicated of technology choice, that the margin in France is not affecting the technology choice margin, but in the Mexican economy, that margin is affected because of the stage of development or something else.
Yeah, there are many elements here, I think, and again, not knowing the situation in France. But the first is what you just mentioned. These are becoming the number one budget items. These unconditional transfers, where
So we're talking about how much of GDP.
I don't know, part of the
Rather speaking, just to have a sense of rate money.
Is this common to all of Latin America? This huge unconditional cash transfers?
well, look at the Bolsa Famiglia in Brazil. Look at Mexico Progresa Oportunidades,
And Argentina
Look
for
at-
sure is a large part.
and
That makes it different from the way it's going on. I mean, Europe, there's a bit of that.
no.
But
This is
there's
huge.
Nothing of that kind.
And let me tell you why this is huge. It's huge because it's very profitable politically.
No, it's a very easy way to buy votes.
But that is the way to buy votes. If people hear, okay, the government is going to put so much, but you're going to put so much too, so that everybody agrees the informality collectively is very bad, and we're going to want everybody to transit to a formal economy, 0 votes. If the alternative is, forget about this guy, let me give you so much, 0 votes. No work is better than any kind of work. That's one thing. And these programs they're just growing and growing, and the extreme to which the present administration, and I'm being recorded, so I have to be, plus I have to be always very prudent. It's just something that really, Second, you don't distort with the policy that you are telling me about France. You don't have these sort of like perverse firm dynamics that I was telling you about. What do I mean with this perverse firm dynamics? In order for you to be able to be the recipient, if you are a firm, of some special tax regime, of some microcredits or whatever, or just trying to evade taxes and whatever, and be informal and sometimes illegal, you have to stay small. So by definition, if you stay small, you are certainly going to be operating at a level of capacity which is certainly below the minimum for optimal or for efficiency. You're not going to be able to get economies of scale, economies of scope. You're not going to be, working with the cutting edge technology. Let me put it to you this way. How much productivity you think, and I don't know whether you're familiar with some of these economies, even a taco stand, street taco stand, invests. They have to invest. Their invest is in the wooden stairs that they buy so that they can go and connect themselves illegally to the grid. Right? That investment is zero. It's nothing. So
To me, it's an argument about the scale at which it applies plus the tax rates. The differential tax rate, but also it operates not at 50, but it operates at 10 employees or 5 employees.
no, basically
Roughly.
the average informal size of given this economic census in Mexico is 5 employees.
Yeah,
So the point is, it's not only, whether at the margin you disincentive people from working or whether you disincentivate and you really make very costly for firms in the formal sector to grow. It's not only that, it's much more than that. Is you are paying and you're incentivizing people to stay in informality and to have very let's say, type of investment that's certainly not cutting edge. People with certainly very far off from having a reasonable level of schooling. And in that sense, having very low total factor productivity. You are investing in low TFP, which is something that is an extreme of what you are saying. I don't think that this is present in European countries. Excuse me?
But I don't think this resembles, especially your system on the net and on the outflow, resembles the depressed area, the non-growing area of Spain, Italy, part of the Greek island. It's a bit different there because there is the tourism effect. People were saying Turkey, but I don't know Turkey well enough.
Plus, how is the
resemble the
But
type of
most of the stuff you
restriction-
mentioned, also happen in Turkey.
how is the social
the
insurance?
president, because of all the transfer, all the cash transfer, the president always win by like 1 or 2% for 4 terms already. So there's nothing to do.
I'm not exactly know the detail, but in Brazil, my experience is that the Bolsa Familia was originally very successful. And I think it's sort of, in some sense, I don't think it was like, stimulating so much informality because you get transfer for like being poor, like really poor, right? So it's a transfer to individuals, not to firms, to try to more eliminate hunger and extreme poverty. But I'm not so sure if there was some distortion that happened over time. But it seems to me that it's like a lack of productivity also very much in the formal sector. Like, for example, in Brazil, you said recently, some very big multinationals live in the country. And it seems to me some of the stagnation in productivity happens more, like even very much so in the formal sector. It's just like there's too much gridlock, and I don't know what's the reason why, hey, maybe the cheaper option to go to Asia, so due to so much costs and so on, and bureaucracy and difficulty and so on. And it seems to me that, that seems to be more of the big issue, the formal sector has not figured out a good way to grow.
I completely agree, but first, I don't know the size in terms of the budget, what these transfers are in Brazil, for example, vis-a-vis Mexico. But it's not limited to those transfers. You get Social Security for free. You get pensions for free. You get health care for free. You get medicines for free. You get eating, in some cases, in some programs for free. So that's the point. It's not only the direct transfer in terms of cash that they give you. It's they give you all Social Security for free. So why would you work? Part of the reasons many people work, especially from certain age onwards, is because of access. You worry about your future when you retire. You worry about your health care. You don't want to have a catastrophic event, and that, of course, bankrupts the whole family, and so on. Why would I pay for that? School myself so that I get access to all of that in the formal sector, which has the formal social security institution, if I get all of these services for free? Why? Why would I, make the effort of increasing my effective human capital if all of that I get for free, apart from the direct cash transfer? So that's the point. And of course, there's also a presence of overall productivity, even in the formal sector, like you're saying.
So let me provide you a concrete example, right?
Yeah.
China, grow fast. Everybody, right? In China, as long as you can find a way to get the particular cities hukou means household registration. If you have the so-called permanent hukou permit, all of those are free. They work hard. They work super hard. Grow very, very fast. A lot of people, zoom to urban. They wait on average for about roughly like 3 to 5 years. They got the so-called red permit, permanent permit. They got all of those free, and they got the incentives already. By your argument, after they got those, they should now, they should quit to work, right? But they don't. They work super hard.
There is a bit of information. I'm saying seriously.
3 to 5 years happy? That's enough? No, I wouldn't buy that.
Well, after you work for 5-7
And
years.
besides, if you work for the government sector, public sector, doesn't have to be central, could be local. Automatic free, you don't have to wait.
So free, like all the social services.
All the social
Healthcare,
benefits, all of those.
Now,
Pension.
I don't know exactly many of the things in China, but they're also doing other stuff. In the sense of we're in the economy of Mexico, you say, okay, the market gives you these firm dynamics and endogenously decides which sectors are profitable, which are not profitable, so on. But in China, you have centralized decisions, and the government is assigning resources. And one of the things that they do is perhaps not assign these resources very well, but the others that they assign perhaps in much better terms than how the market is assigning them in countries like Mexico, because the incentives are not there to assign them to the more efficient production. I don't know. The thing is that just some of the things that stand alone here in an economy like Mexico give you these incentives. But I can think of doing more things like perhaps in China and mitigating some of these wrong signals or whatever.
No, I
was talking
totally,
about- no.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
Those are wrong policies.
Yeah.
But somehow it's deeper than just right or wrong. But
Just
even
look at
the
firm
same wrong
churning.
policy. Some countries survive and they even doing well, right?
But just look at firm churning. Like the firm churning in Mexico, the firm dynamic that you have is huge. Just from let's say from the 4 million that firms that are cut, in 3.8 million or so that are cut in the 1990 census, only about 10% survive all the way to the 2018 census, where now there are 6 million and so firms. So that means that through all of these years, millions die and millions exit and these are endogenous to the incentives that you have in the economy as a whole. I'm sure that you don't have this type of firm dynamics in China, because in China you have perhaps these policies as you're saying, but then again, the government certainly picking winners and putting cheap credit to certain sectors and giving a lot of subsidies for high tech and whatever. So there are a lot of policies they are also taking, not only these kind of, let's say, social security and taxation policies which give you wrong incentives that mitigate the distortions that you come from this.
The industry selection in China had been pretty good.
Yeah.
For a while. Now, right?
So I think we should be,
I mean, like,
It sounds like a wonderful project for a serious couple of PhD.
sorry,
Comparing, because it's a quantitative matter.
Yeah. I mean,
The two cases. And it's true that,
the contrast will be interesting, right?
Mexico versus China.
Yeah. And what China did wrong is like the whole housing sector collapsed,
Yeah.
right? so something is right, something is wrong.
again, this is a good time to,
Perfect. Yeah.
to close, and so we have time, this is a seminar that can be here in 10 minutes or so.
Oh, yes.
When thanks Manuel for a very insightful presentation and a very good discussion.
Let me just say something very quickly. The first part of the work is something that I've done personally. I have a couple of papers published and so on. But the second part, the growth, even though we were deputy ministers and the finance ministry at the same time. Santiago was in the expenditure side, I was on the revenue side. So we didn't always talk on very, let's say, diplomatic terms, but we became very good friends. And even although we talk about this, but this is not my work.
No.
This is something that we've talked about through a long, and I agree with this, and we've, come back and forth. But the one that has written it down, I write more papers in
We reserve the
microfinance.
finance discussion for dinner again.
Okay, so thank you.
I blame you for the taxes. I blame
The theory of that will be
That's right.